Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 28th of November 2022, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish. We're delighted to be joined by David Scott, bringing us Northern Exposure from north of the border, and Mark Anderson reporting from the United States.
And a special guest.
And indeed, we have a special guest.
Right, okay, let's get straight on then with the online safety bill. What's going on with that? It's coming back to Parliament in the next couple of weeks. And in an effort to try to convince anybody that it's not about shutting down free speech, here's Michelle Donnellan. This morning, I'm determined that the abhorrent trolls encouraging the young and vulnerable to self-harm are to be brought to justice because they've brought in a new amendment to cover this. So I'm strengthening our online safety laws to make sure these vile acts are stamped out and the perpetrators face jail time. Social media firms can no longer remain silent bystanders either, and they'll face fines for allowing this abusive and destructive behaviour to continue on their platforms under our laws. Now, of course, this is stuff that the UK government had originally decided would not be included in the online safety bill, but because of the furore over the attack on freedom of speech, they're now trying to cover their backs, as it were, and divert attention away from the freedom of speech issues. So the question is the issue of legal but harmful content, is it being scrapped? Is it being scrapped or not? The answer to that, of course, is, well, let's wait and see. It's not exactly clear what's going to happen to this particular part of the legislation. This is a pretty critical time, and I think people should be very much talking about this with their representatives and so on as necessary. But David, where does that take us with respect to whether Twitter, with respect to Twitter?
Well, good news, I think. It looks as though my Twitter account, Albion_Rover, banned for talking truthfully and tweeting out accurate government statistics on vaccine injuries. And Patrick Henningson's at 21st Wire Twitter account, banned for broadly similar reasons, may be back because Elon Musk, he had a Twitter poll. Should Twitter offer a general amnesty to the suspended accounts, provided they've not broken the law or engaged in egregious spam? 72% said yes, and Elon said the people have spoken, and the amnesty begins next week. Well, that's this week now, so my account's not turned on yet, but I live in hope. Unlike Professor Susan Mitchie of Spy B, who does not live in hope. She was actually quite unhappy about it. Okay, that's it, she said. When all these blocked accounts return, I will go. She doesn't want the blocked accounts, people who can argue a case and put forward evidence. The hate tweets are bad enough as it is. For anyone wishing to follow me in future, I'm in Mastodon. A much more positive experience, and many have already joined. So she wasn't very happy about that, and I thought I should say cheerio. So through another account, Mises Scotland, I did say to her, before you go, Susan, do you have any regrets about using fear to coerce and manipulate people into taking an untried and untested experimental medical treatment without giving informed, express, voluntary and individual consent? And in response to that, she blocked me. So she's not very keen on debating the issues, it would seem. Maybe she defines arguing this as online hate. Does hate actually mean saying things that she doesn't agree with, or she can't face, or she can't refute, or argue against? Perhaps it does. Now, on the subject of Susan Mitchie and the general tendency towards government-led behavioural change, I've come across a House of Lords report. It's called In Our Hands. That alone's a bit creepy. Behaviour change for climate and environmental goals. And to discuss this, I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Bruce Scott, who's a psychologist and who's written for the column and is campaigning on the inappropriate and harmful use of psychology and looking for a more ethical approach to be introduced by his profession. Bruce, welcome.
Well, hello, David. It's good to be here.
So, behaviour change for climate and environmental goals. What did you think of this document?
Well, I was actually horrified that this document is chilling in its entirety. The slick language, so to speak, that they use, the way the condescension and infantilization of the population is extremely alarming. Just a little fact about the document. I've typed in the word consent to the PDF. It comes up 2 times, directing you to another document. And COVID-19, in the context of lessons, we have to learn lessons from COVID, as in so great experiment. We can use this for the climate, and it's utterly horrifying.
Yeah, they were absolutely clear on this. The COVID-19 is a lesson we're going to use and we're going to run again. And I particularly liked the quoted Sir Patrick Vallance in the document. Quote, "We saw over the pandemic that we had legions of armchair epidemiologists who got quite interested in seeing what was going on. The same is true if data is made available with completely independent, objective and robust information. It will help people to understand how we are doing, and it can link to the clarity of messaging around what individuals can do." Now, that is either Merriam-Webster Word of the Year, apparently, gaslighting, or he is the most naive and uninformed man in the world. I wonder which it is.
I think it's utter arrogance, because there's another quote in that document where he quotes how he's suddenly become an environmental specialist all of a sudden. We weren't allowed to become epidemiologists or scientists during the COVID thing. He's suddenly allowed to become a specialist on the environment. And one of the quotes he said was that we need to get the net zero, something along those lines, and that it's unarguable. I mean, in other words, we will not be allowed to argue. And with a reference to the online harms bill and censorship, this is a very real threat, I think.
Yes, and I was also interested that there was actually a minority report at the end put forward by Lord Lilly, Peter Lilly, and he lost the vote on that. He was the only one to vote for the minority position. And the minority position, I'm always interested when politicians actually stand alone, because it's a safety in crowds kind of sport. And his minority position was very tightly argued. And one of the core points was that even under the Climate Change Committee estimates, the official stats, lifestyle changes are only going to account for perhaps 10% or perhaps much less of the changes in greenhouse gases. So all of this document, which emphasizes all the way through the essential nature of behavioral control, is only going to provide a very small minority, maybe 10% of the CO2 reduction. And remember how small CO2 is as a percentage of the atmosphere, and how small our contribution and how small humanity's contribution is. So we're talking an infinitesimal fraction, an irrelevant fraction. So he's demonstrating that the science is not backing up this as being necessary. But he got voted down 11-1 on that. Everyone else seemed to be all on board with the behavioural control.
Yeah. Well, there's a table in that in the document as well, and the top things they want to target if they get their way, is people driving, people flying, diet, and building and construction homes. They're like in the top sort of 5 or 6 things. Yeah. If it only contributes to 10%, so to speak, why are they going after ordinary people in ordinary ways of living? But of course, they're throughout the document. It's scattered with references to changing our habits, nudging us into different social norms, and of course, taking lessons from the pandemic. It will involve the usual shaming people to adopt things, and it's, of course, there's other spectres outside this document, because it's very linked to public health, this idea. And there's in things that's been happening in Canada, for example, the idea that if you're an anti-vaxxer, you could be psychiatrically diminished in some way, and you need to be treated against your will. No doubt, if it comes to areas of public health being a danger to the self, others, and the environment, they will be, because there's lots of references in this document to regulations and to legislation to enforce it. It's really chilling.
Yeah. So I've found quite a few. This is one of many documents. There are a few others to run past you. Here we've got the Climate Change Committee, Behaviour Change, Public Engagement and Net Zero. And this is based on work by Imperial College London. So what could go wrong? The very people who gave us the COVID pandemic. And they've got some key findings listed there. The first one is the public are to become engaged with the climate challenge and contribute to achieving net zero emissions, then the wider policy context will also need to be more supportive. New, compelling narratives will be needed to inspire and mobilise mainstream participation in solutions, adoption of technologies and change in behaviours. That sounds like propaganda to me.
Yes, it's newspeak for the further agenda. I mean, the link. There's a linked document in that there the one we're discussing. There's a linked one about consent, and it's by the Climate Change Committee, another one, and there's a table in it in this, and I'll just read out the little what it says. It's about public awareness and consumer choices, and I thought this was astounding. It's public understanding and consent for the transition process and what it will entail for their homes and businesses is a prerequisite for the building's transition. If people are not aware of the changes they need to make and options for making these changes and the required pace of change, the transition will continue to stall. And of course, so they're wanting to implement ways to will have no choice. There's a reference by one of the committee in there to essentially make things so much more expensive for the things that they don't want us to have, like food, like driving, etc. So very, very worrying.
Yeah.
And of course,
so going back. Sorry, just going back to the Climate Change Committee. The other things they mention here is the government is going to take a pragmatic approach and learn by doing. They don't know what they're going to do. They don't know if it'll work, but they're going to do it anyway and then find out. And then it's obviously all about the data. I had a quick look at who is the Climate Change Committee, amongst others. There's some engineers and things on there and some climate specialists, unfortunately, from East Anglia University. But also it's led by John Selwyn Gummer, and we have Professor Nick Chater, who is a behavioural scientist at Warwick Business School. So he's one of the leading lights. Do you know anything about him?
I don't know, but I did look at some of the members of the committee. I just did a quick scan because you can check out their interests. And some of their interests, conflicts of interests, Ladyton Brown, she's involved in biosecurity and nuclear threats. There was a lady, Chalker, she's involved with some company to do with sustainability, unsurprisingly. I noticed, I can't remember who it was, but someone's got mining interests. Don't think that's very good for the environment. Lord Colgrane has building projects as an interest. Lord Lucas is involved in the surveillance industry. And someone else, Northover, I think it is, Lady or Lord Northover. They have a company called Med Access, which is about healthcare products. I mean, the fingers and the pies. I mean, they're not independent. I thought this is like a House of Lords document. I thought the House of Lords are meant to keep in line. I don't hold much faith.
So I went looking for a wee bit more, and we got this the Human BC project, sponsored by the Wellcome Trust, of course, and University College London. and it's developing an AI system to continually scan, organize, and interpret human behavior change literature. So the AI is going to interpret the literature. That doesn't fill me with a great deal of joy, but it did take me to the University College London. And of course, that is the Centre for Behavioural Change. And here we see the woman herself, Professor Susan Mitchie, who doesn't like me on Twitter, but I'm sure she's a lovely lady if you meet her in person. She's obviously a communist, but we don't talk about that because she doesn't talk about that because it's nothing to do with her job. Her entire belief system and worldview doesn't influence her scientific pronouncements in any way, shape, or form, which is quite remarkable. And a few others from that organisation. We've got Professor Angel Chater. I don't know if she's related to the other Chater we just saw. More on her in extra time. And Dr. Lou Atkins. Now, this is quite interesting. So she's a researcher, trainer, consultant in behavioural change, intervention, design and evaluation. Dr. Atkins coordinates the course and advanced modules of the training and leads the CBC's Australasian Hub. And she's also co-author of the book Behavioural Change Wheel, a guide to designing interventions. And I thought it was very interesting that Australasia, the area where we have Jacinda Ardern with a single source of truth, and the most egregious violence and infringements on our rights during the lockdown, almost anywhere in the world was in Australia. And here we see the Centre for Behavioural Change, University College London, Susan Mitchie and her colleague Lou Atkins have a link straight down to the Australasian Hub. See, Lou Atkins is an honorary academic at the University of Auckland. And Brian, you might like this. They're also researching end-of-life care and behavioural change. That one, I must admit, I find a bit threatening.
Well, I think you should, because it's clear that this sort of applied behavioural psychology is running rampant inside the NHS as a result of their transformation and common purpose agenda. So we need to do a lot more work on this.
And David, finally, the behavioural change wheel.
Yes, a behavioural change wheel. This is the book and tool written by Susan Mitchie and Lou Atkins and Robert West working together. And I did have a little look into the literature very briefly on end-of-life care and behavioural change. Much of it Belgian. Obviously, Belgium's has 20 years experience of euthanasia, and we're seeing very many concerning stories coming out of there. Well, also, they seem to be very interested in behavioural control and end-of-life care. More on that, perhaps, from Debbie Evans on another programme.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Now let's move on to the issue of life sciences and, the vaccine task force. Now the government has announced today they're going to use the vaccine task force model to tackle health challenges. So if anybody's forgotten, the vaccine task force was set up in April 2020 by Boris Johnson along with Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. And this was in order to facilitate the path towards the introduction of a COVID-19 vaccine. And it was all coordinated research efforts of government with industry, academics and funding agencies to make sure that they could expedite vaccine development and deployment. That was originally falling under the remit of the Department for Business. But then in, I think, March 2021, it moved to the Department of Health. And the person put in charge of that was this lady, Kate Bingham, who, as you can see there, 30 years with various investment organizations. And that's really what it was all about, big business. Now, they published their life sciences vision. The government published their life sciences vision last year in July. And then today, they have published this. Life sciences, what's next for this top UK sector, and it's back to the UK Board of Trade, so that's good stuff. So let's see, how do we grow UK life sciences industry? They've got 4 recommendations. Build more facilities to encourage life sciences startups to scale up in the UK, drive more homegrown talent and drive more global experts into the UK, immigration, promote regional investment opportunities for the UK's life sciences sector. And so Kemi Badnoch is in Wales today to do exactly that. We'll talk about that in a second. And leverage overseas networks to boost demand. That's what the MHRA seems to be doing largely at the moment. So there we go. The government, Kemi Badnoch is in Wales today to deal with this.
Okay, thank you for that, Mike. Mark Anderson, we bring you in here. I've advanced your segment. So you'd been looking at a video of protests in China. We haven't got the video clip itself, but I got a screenshot that was taken from that clip. So you've been paying attention to what's been happening here, and also you've got some comment as a result of the trial that took place in Hong Kong of Cardinal Zen. So what's been happening, Mark?
Well, in my continued coverage of the Red Pill Conference in Utah, which is ongoing because I have a 3-month subscription, this came out in William F. Jasper's speech about Cardinal Zen, and he's been arrested and fined. He's since been released, and I'll get more into the context of that in a minute. But in so doing, it came across this video, and the commentators here correctly noted that this appears to be the largest protest, the most significant one since Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese people, the citizens, are protesting against the central government itself. And it's mainly over the ongoing lockdowns and the COVIDocracy. So it's just significant in and of itself that the Chinese people are turning their wrath toward Xi Jinping. I hope I'm saying his name right, the Chinese premier. And they're not as docile as maybe we've been led to believe there. So that's
David,
very encouraging to see that.
David, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, yes, I mean, I've been following this story as well, and like Mark, I've been watching some video, and I'm relying on other people translating what's been said. But one of the translations was a member of the crowd facing the police in a fairly violent interaction with the police, is shouting at the police, "Give me liberty or give me death," which is a novel thing for a Chinese demonstration. So we've got a wee bit more information on this. I thought Mark would like that one, being American. BBC News reporting that in China there's a record number of COVID cases. So they've done all the lockdown, but it's not working. They've now got a record number of cases.
Yeah, but hold on a second, David. Hold on a second. We've got a country of 1.5 billion people, and this record number of COVID cases is something around 40,000. So, the BBC is slightly misrepresenting the situation by, I'm just looking at the text that you've put on screen there, and they're not actually talking the statistics.
They're not talking the statistics, but they are. But neither is the Chinese government talking the statistics. And they've got here a Cambridge University academic, William Hurst, is saying lockdowns prevent COVID outbreaks from spreading, he says, but they also exert incredibly strict social control. And it's the incredibly strict social control and the reaction of the people to it that does seem to be, as far as we can tell with information coming out, which is limited, does seem to be real. So we got actually quite a good piece here from Sky News, which I'll try and cover very quickly. They're reporting that patience is running out in China over the COVID lockdowns, and it poses a major challenge to the ruling Communist Party. This is a very good report, and I'll encourage people to look it out, by Helen Ann Smith. So she says that the spark for the Shanghai protests was a fire in a city of Rumqi in Xinjiang province in the far west of the country. 10 people, including children, died. It was alleged that a coronavirus lockdown prevented them from leaving the building and prevented firefighters from speedy access. And the protests erupted on Friday night. And she says, in addition to Shanghai, there have been protests overnight at the university in Nanjing, Wuhan, and in Beijing. And in recent days and weeks, people have taken to the streets and clashed with police, basically all over the country. There's a sense that patience is running out. Many Chinese have watched the opening World Cup matches on television and wondering why the rest of the world is getting on with life and gathering unmasked in large stadiums while they're at risk of being locked in their homes at short notice or having their businesses shut down and unable to trade. This is very interesting, and we might come to this an extra time, the effect of TV showing what's happening in other parts of the world on authoritarian regimes. She says people's lives are still dominated by the need to constantly be tested, and they're unable to enter public places without it. and anytime they could get stuck inside if they're linked to a positive case. This sounds vaguely familiar, gentlemen. And she says there's a sense that the government's aware of the anger and the cost to the people. However, make no mistake, the sheer number of protests breaking out hasn't been seen in years, maybe even decades, and it poses a major challenge to the Communist Party. It's unclear how they'll respond. She concludes its control of the top Communist Party's control of state and society is also so deep and ingrained that any talk of this is somehow toppling its rule is almost certainly naive. But what is happening in China right now is nonetheless extraordinary. Levels of public anger and dissent that haven't been seen in many years. The current trajectory feels increasingly untenable. So it's an excellent report from Sky News, but I would also point out that Leo Kersh, a comedian on Twitter, responded to Sky News and said, Sky News was talking about the remarkable bravery of the anti-lockdown protesters in China, and Leo Kersh pointed out, wait a minute, when we protested against lockdown, we were decried as selfish, granny-killing idiots. Why is the exact same thing considered brave in China? Which I think is a very good question.
I think there's a lot of questions still to be raised on this one, David, particularly as there's still an undertone that we can expect more lockdowns in the future, but that's tied in, I think, with some of the applied behavioural psychology. So, Mark, take us on to the subject of Cardinal Zen.
Yeah, at that speech, and you can see him in the upper right-hand corner there by William F. Jasper, the New American writer, mid-November at the most recent Red Pill Expo in Salt Lake City, Utah. One of the things among several that Bill Jasper brought up, and I think there's other things that are on tap today that he spoke about for today's column, but Cardinal Joseph Zen is shown there, and Jasper brought him up in the context that Pope Francis has completely embraced climate change. He's all in with the World Economic Forum and with many of the leading lights, the global double domes at the Economic Forum. So what Jasper was saying is Pope Francis has time to meet with Bono. He has time to meet with Jeffrey Sachs, a CFR boy who supports abortion. Pope Francis has time to meet with Bill Gates and the likes of other globalists, but he's been largely silent on the plight of Cardinal Joseph Zen, the former Bishop of Hong Kong, who was, as it notes here, he was convicted over his support of a fund to help arrested Hong Kong protesters. Now, it did result in only a fine, and he's not in jail, but it's the principle of the thing, according to Mr. Jasper, of why the Pope is all in with the globalists and ignores this brave cardinal in Hong Kong. And it says here in an Associated Press report, a 90-year-old, he's 90 years old, Roman Catholic cardinal and 5 others in Hong Kong were fined after being found guilty Friday, that's this past Friday, of failing to register a now defunct fund that aimed to help people arrested in the widespread Hong Kong protests 3 years ago. Cardinal Zen, a retired bishop and a vocal democracy advocate of the city, arrived at court in a black outfit and used a walking stick. He was first arrested in May on suspicion of colluding with foreign forces under a Beijing-imposed national security law. His arrest sent shockwaves through the Catholic community, and then the Associated Press said, although the Vatican only stated it was monitoring the development of the situation closely, the Vatican claims to be monitoring this. And what's interesting here is while Cardinal Zen and the other activists at the trial have not yet been charged with national security related charges, they were charged with failing to properly register the 612 Humanitarian Relief Fund, as it's called, which helped pay medical and legal fees for arrested Hong Kong protesters beginning in 2019. That fund ceased operations in October of 2021. But what that's indicating here is that Cardinal Zen may not be out of the woods yet. He still could get charged under China's national security law, which could bring heavier charges to this 90-year-old cardinal. But again, Bill Jasper really took the Pope to task, and Mr. Jasper is Catholic himself, for siding with the globalists and ignoring people like Cardinal Zen. So that was among the powerful things that Mr. Jasper spoke about at the Red Pill.
Mark, I'd just add to that as an ending that, of course, in UK, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, head of the Church of England, spends all of his time, is widely known to be hobnobbing with the banking elite and the globalists and the climate change agenda. So there seems to be little difference between the Pope and the head of the Church of England. I'll just throw that one in.
David, you've got a couple of clips here with respect to Judge Andrew Napolitano.
Yeah, so the first one's not only for Mark, coming from America, it's also for Brian. Some years ago, Brian, I came up with the phrase, we don't have a government, we've got an occupying power, to try and educate people how they should respond to the threats posed by the state. And you simplified that to it's a government of occupation. Well, this first clip is Judge Andrew Napolitano, a constitutionalist, libertarian thinker, and very much someone who stands on the American Constitution, discovering and learning and speaking about exactly the same problem, but from an American perspective.
Jefferson wanted government to be chained down to the Constitution, and government has broken those chains. Government is now the master rather than the servant. And the sooner we recognize this, the better off we'll be. The sooner we realize that government steals our property, steals our liberty, restrains our freedom, insinuates itself in our economic activities, all for its own benefit. The sooner we recognize that, the better off we'll be. Government fights wars so that it can grow and it can enrich its benefactors. And it doesn't care what innocents are slaughtered. Just look at what's going on in Ukraine. It's being done to help the American military-industrial complex.
Yeah, I think Steve.
So just before we go on to the second one, that's some trends in the news, Jill Salente's programme. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to add at this point?
Well, what he's saying is essentially true, but the most prevalent thing that's going on with the governments of the UK, with the United States, and across Europe is it's not so much the government in and of itself that's doing these things. The government itself in the US, like these other governments, are captive to these private forces. The banking cartel in particular, which goes back to the times of antiquity, in terms of the formation of what became modern banking. And then that banking cartel created what I call the mass media cartel. So governments do abuse things. Government is often too big. Sometimes it overregulates when it should keep its hands off. Sometimes it regulates the wrong things and is laissez-faire in areas where it should regulate. But the overriding thing, although Judge Napolitano is essentially right, is that governments are under private control and themselves are captive, and then they become the kneecappers for these private forces against us. That's the one little element that Judge Napolitano left out in an otherwise pretty sound commentary.
Well, just to explore it further, we've got one more clip from Judge Napolitano and talking about the nature of America and the nature of the government and the state agencies and how much influence they've had. He was talking about the JFK assassination, the anniversary of which has just passed, I think, and without much comment in the mainstream media, and he had this to say.
Trump told me he would release all the JFK records before he left office. We had a conversation right around the time he pardoned Roger Stone. So now it's about Christmas time of his last year in office, where he admitted to his friends that he lost, but he was still saying publicly that the election was stolen. And I said, aren't you going to release those records? You only have a month to go. And he said to me, Judge, if you saw what I saw, you would know why I can't release them. What are you talking about? It's like, wow. I can't tell you on the phone. The next time I see him in person, I'll tell you. I haven't seen him in person since then. Well, what the hell could he have seen?
Mark, what could he have seen?
Maybe he saw the truth.
That's an interesting one. There was another conference that just concluded here in Texas, in the Dallas area. There's conferences there every year, and in the 20 teens, 2010, 2011, up through about 2013, I was at a lot of those conferences, different ones, the Lancer Group, the Conference on Political Assassinations, or Coalition on Political Assassinations, COPA. The leader of that, John Judge, since passed away. And I listened to a lot of different views and theories on Kennedy. And some people would say that the documents are kind of a red herring. They get everybody excited. There's going to be this release. And in the past, there's been more incremental release of documents, and they turned out to be rather anticlimactic. A little juicy tidbit here, a little juicy tidbit there, but nothing really earth-shattering. And so some have said, speculated, granted, that this taunting of there's going to be this release of documents and it's going to blow things wide open is sometimes used by the powers that be to keep the researchers kind of off balance. And so it's a tough call. I certainly would like to see whatever documents Trump was referring to when he had this apparent conversation with Judge Napolitano. I'm not saying all the documents are insignificant, and I'd like to see him as much as the next guy, but I'm just saying that in the past, it's been rather anticlimactic and disappointing and almost used as a tool of manipulation. I had a friend, I'll just mention it now, Brian David Anderson, that I did some research with, and I just want to use this episode to honor his passing. He died November 1st in California. He's an alternative health practitioner, and he died, ironically, of a health issue. And he and I did some research on the Kennedy thing. I can go more in depth another time. I just want to mention his passing and kind of dedicate my comments to him. He was a pretty insightful guy, but he said that too, that he thought the documents, while there could be good tidbits here and there, were largely disappointing. So nevertheless, we'll see what happens. Next year, 2023, is the 60th anniversary. Hopefully something more substantive will come out.
Okay,
Okay, we've got more on that in extra time. Thanks so much, Mark.
Okay, if you like what the UK Column does and you'd like to support us, then please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. There are options to help us out there, or you can pick something up at the shop. But please do share material you find on the various platforms. And David, just a very brief advert for the NHS nurses fight for freedom of belief.
Yes, this is Amy Gallagher, who's suing the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, who put her on disciplinary procedures because she pushed back against the woke agenda, the training in whiteness, the attack on Christian belief, and on Western values in general. She asked some questions, and they didn't like being questioned one little bit.
Okay, thank you for that, David. Well, we had some communication from some French individuals a few days ago who said to us that there are a lot of people in the French public who are now what you're seeing with Social Security on the block.
Well, the red tide that became the red trickle of the 2022 midterms brought about a small edge in the House of Representatives, as I note here, 219 to 212 for the Republicans. And the Senate's more or less up for grabs as Herschel Walker is facing a December 6th runoff with the incumbent senator there, Raphael Warnock in the state of Georgia, U.S. senators, of course, at the U.S. level. And we'll see, that could have some effect on this. But 2025 will be the 90th year of the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935 in the wake of the Great Depression. And of course, the idea is that when people are less able to work, either due to disability and or age, they can't starve to death. So there would be a stipend, and that would be paid to them. Now, the big kids on the block, such as the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, named after a former chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations who since passed away. For a long time, the Peterson Foundation has been agitating that, Social Security cannot be sustained. And it's one of the largest budget items. Yes, it is, but so is interest to the banking cartel. But they don't want to talk about that. But Social Security is one of these large budget items. It can't be sustained. What are we going to do? These entitlements that these seniors want, it's just outrageous. But as this article points out, Social Security, like Medicare, have been paid by wage and salary set-asides, by withholdings. All they are, and E. Michael Jones has pointed this out until he's blue in the face, they are deferred wages. This is not a dole. This is not welfare in the strict sense. This is deferred wages. People paid into the system, and of course they're entitled to it because they worked for it. And so, nevertheless, the Republicans come in with this hyper laissez-faire kind of view on this, certainly not a populist one like American Free Press is known for. And they're starting to talk this way. It mentions in here that Senator Mike Lee of Utah, according to Barron's, brings to a round dozen the number of sitting GOP senators who have said quite openly that they want to put Social Security on the chopping block one way or another. Then you've got Republican Senators Rick Scott of Florida, who's a former governor there, and the infamous Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, and the unscrupulous longtime corporate raider Senator Mitt Romney of Utah. They have also voiced support in varying degrees for tweaking, or as they euphemistically say, saving Social Security. So the irony here is, while a lot of people are hopeful that the Republican tide, even though it was smaller than expected, will bring a number of improvements, the Social Security being arguably a little bit more threatened under Republican control of the House, it is kind of a downside to the GOP gaining control in many people's views. Because again, it's not really welfare. And another factor in this is that Kyrsten Sinema, who happens to be a Democrat in the U.S. Senate, even though she's a Democrat, she popped up at the 2022 Bilderberg meeting that happened in D.C. this past summer, and she's been vocal, according to Barron's, in giving tax breaks, supporting tax breaks that the U.S. gives to private equity honchos, hedge fund tycoons, and venture capitalists. So Kyrsten Sinema seems to be on the Democratic side, someone who might side with the Republicans to tweak away or trim away or possibly seriously cut Social Security. And as I mentioned at the end of this article, this is an important point, the real solution to this would appear to be if the U.S. could get out from under the Federal Reserve System and issue United States currency, ironically, as JFK tried to do in the early 60s, and some people say his demise was based on that decision to replace Federal Reserve notes with United States notes that don't bear interest. Therefore, there'd be, far less interest, if any, to pay, because there'd be really no national debt ultimately. So if the U.S. could get control of its monetary system, it could create a alternative to Social Security, or it could make Social Security totally solvent, in which case there'd never be any threat to the system at all ever again, even though the number of workers paying in versus the recipients keeps going down. And that's, of course, not a good thing. Fewer and fewer workers to pay for more and more recipients. But that's only a problem under the Federal Reserve System. It probably would not be under a United States currency system that Kennedy supported. So people can contact me through UK Column if they want to read more on that article. And it's interesting, though. Social Security is certainly at a crossroads, and I'm trying to kind of hit it hard here before the 90th anniversary comes up in 2025. So there you go on that one.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, of course, you brought the subject quite rightly back into the subject of money, and particularly big money. Just very quickly, take us through the key points from the red pill about the powerful elites who certainly seem to believe that they are in control.
Yeah, Bill Jasper, who I knew casually in the 1990s when he made appearances speaking in Indiana. As I noted earlier, he spoke at the most recent Red Pill in Utah, mid-November. And among the things he brought up, besides Cardinal Zen, which we talked about earlier, and the Pope's hypocrisy on helping the globalists and not Zen, he brought up this very interesting item by the British futuristic writer, both nonfiction and science fiction writer, H.G. Wells, Herbert George Wells. Herbert George Wells, and unbeknownst to me, I'm fairly well informed on this guy. He wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, Blueprints for a World Revolution. And Mr. Jasper interestingly noted, everything the World Economic Forum has been pushing, quote, was already foretold in 1928 in this book, The Open Conspiracy, end quote. And I trust Bill. Bill does his homework, that's for sure. And he went on to quote Klaus Schwab, the future is not just happening, quote, unquote. And what Bill Jasper went on to say is, this is their open conspiracy, the open conspiracy now. And here we're seeing it on the screen. The future is not just happening. The future is built by us, by a powerful community, as you here in this room, as Schwab told the forum in Davos in 2021. Thanks for showing that. What Bill Jasper added, keeping an eye on time, this is their open conspiracy, the modern one reflecting what H.G. Wells spoke about. This is what they admit. They believe they've proceeded to such a level that they can reveal quite a bit of their plans at this time. So that was an interesting twist in Mr. Jasper's presentation to the Red Pill Expo. Now, what we're seeing here now, his topic, as noted, secret societies are more powerful than ever. This is Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, who married into the family. And she spoke up, well, Bill Jasper spoke of her activities, of why we need a new kind of capitalism. And that has to do with the future, the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism. Now, I didn't have much time to read up on that a great deal, but inclusive capitalism is just really kind of a reformed socialistic globalism. And they talk about stakeholders and shareholders, but they never really talk about the citizens, the public, very much. It's always stakeholders and shareholders. And there you're showing Pope Francis meeting with Jeffrey Sachs, and he's a Soros agent, Mr. Sachs is. He's affiliated with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Council on Foreign Relations, World Economic Forum, population control, abortion, and world government. And Mr. The Pope Francis has been giving him plenty of his time and attention, and not Cardinal Zen. But anyway, the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism has a number of ideas that really are just window dressing and seek to enforce the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations and to address and tackle climate change. And so a lot of it is just big talk and window dressing, so they can kind of put addressing climate change and things like that in a somewhat more appetizing context and get away from socialism and make it look like it's capitalism. But as I noted in my Social Security article that I talked about a few minutes ago, monopoly capitalism and free enterprise are not the same thing. And so this inclusive capitalism is just a variation of monopoly capitalism, which is much more compatible with socialism than it is with free enterprise, and certainly is compatible with globalism. So it's a lot of doublespeak, which we've come to expect. And Mr. Jasper was illuminating that, again, while showing that the ideas the World Economic Forum is embracing and promoting apparently go back as far as 1928 and the insights of H.G. Wells. So that gives an interesting, rather new historical context to what the WEF has been doing.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, one thing is for certain, that these powerful groups have been very active around the war in Ukraine. But let's give our audience an update. A lot happening over the last few days and certainly over the weekend. Now, of course, much of the activity on the front is simply not being recorded by the so-called mainstream media. So I've taken some help from some of the social media channels, which do have some very good information, but even they are suffering from a lack of information from the front itself. But suffice to say that there's been fighting on all the key areas of the front in the east, and particularly in the vicinity of Donetsk and the key town or small city of Bakhmut, where the Russians have been applying a great deal of force to the front. The Bakhmut battle, here's the urban area itself, circled, but there's brutal fighting going on at the moment, and it's quite clear that the casualties are extremely high. but no details of that really coming out from the Ukrainian or the Russian side, except the phrase hundreds of dead and wounded has been used by some of the reporting bodies. Ukraine is trying to hold on to this city because if they lose it, it will allow the Russians to move west, really through the defended lines, and this will be a key gain by the Russians. But as to be expected, the Ukrainians are fighting very hard for this territory and are pouring in men and the weapons they do have to try and hold the Russians. This is illustrative of some of the pictures that did come out or have been coming out of Bakhmut. You can see the state of the troops. One of the men has got quite what appears to be quite a severe injury on his arm. But the troops are fighting in horrible conditions. That's both on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. And some of the commentators are highlighting comparisons between in the conditions between World War One, around the Ypres battle, with rain and mud and carnage and flooded trenches. So that's what you see on the left, and on the right are equivalent pictures from the war in Ukraine. So this is very vile stuff, and of course it would not be happening if the UK, the US, NATO and the West had not been pouring weapons into Ukraine to fight what is essentially a proxy war. Now, I've put together some short video clips which I'll talk through here, but I'm going to take these as declared online. They may be true or may not, but they are indicative of the sort of battles going on. So here we appear to have a convoy that had been attacked and tanks were burning. We've talked about this before. We're not sure whether it's white phosphorus or thermite. Some of the viewers have told us it's thermite. From rocket systems used by the Russians. This is a short clip showing that the Ukrainians are now forced to use ordinary vehicles. They're running short of proper armoured vehicles, and this is a significant letdown. But these men trying to move a mortar very quickly somewhere close to the front get attacked, as we see in this explosion. And of course, these are small skirmishes that are happening right the way across the front. Convoy attacked here. You can see the huge explosion which occurs from one of these vehicles, which was clearly carrying ammunition. What should we be saying to our audience? That in every one of these shots, young men are dying. This is a nighttime attack on a tank using an anti-tank weapon. That's the fuzzy, blurred, moving shape coming to the center of your screen. And ultimately, with a direct hit, we can be sure that more young men, I can't be sure they're Ukrainian, I believe they are, will have died as a result of Western weapons. So truly horrific conditions on the front. And this is just to reinforce the fact that the mud, it hasn't yet frozen, it's starting to freeze, but the muddy conditions are so bad that vehicles are getting stuck very easily. But once again, we see ordinary civilian type vehicles having to be used by the fighting forces on the Ukrainian side. So what is the BBC doing? Well, of course, the BBC only wants more killing. So this is an article which caught my attention. Ukraine war, Russian atrocities bring NATO members closer. This is written by Katya Adler, who is the BBC Europe editor. This is the statement under the image. Ukraine has turned support from NATO allies into success on the battlefield. Well, I don't think we were seeing success on the battlefield in those clips. And of course, the reality is that Ukrainian casualties overall horrific, perhaps 100,000 men killed. But the BBC's only interested in the war continuing. This is some of the comments from Ms. Adler. If you'd ask, she's quoting a US official, but it's from her article. She's saying, if you asked me back in February or even 6 months ago, there's no way I'd have predicted the unity we now have in our ranks. And that is a quote she is giving from a US official, but a US official who's unidentified told her. And this sort of thing goes on through the article. So there's another quote from the article here. The strong resolve to stand with Ukraine. that we see now has been helped by atrocities by Russia, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. A leading NATO official told me on condition of anonymity. Like many of the officials I spoke to, they would prefer to be able to speak more freely. Don't you think, Mike, that if they were keen to speak out and everything was going well in NATO, they'd be very happy to give their names? Why would they be so shy? Perhaps what they're saying isn't actually the truth, but we're never going to know who the person was because the BBC keeps them secret. And Miss Adler goes on, repeat there, beg your pardon for that, goes on here, Moscow has tried to blackmail or manipulate nations supporting Ukraine with a "we can make you suffer too" message, an official from a large NATO country told me. So this is effectively a hearsay report which the UK public are to take as reality. This photograph appeared in the article itself, and this is underlying the fact that we've got support from the NATO allies has been turned into success. And it goes on here to say, so NATO has considerably boosted defence capabilities for its eastern flank of member countries geographically close to Russia, but the alliance says it has no organised mission inside Ukraine. It's not training Ukrainian soldiers or providing Kiev with military support as an organisation. Well, that's got to be unbelievably disingenuous at best, because it's quite clear that NATO is coordinating support for the Ukrainians in this war. So I'm going to put this down to more lies by the BBC. And of course, the UK column a few days ago put down the reality of Ukraine destroyed, economy destroyed, electrical system destroyed, everything destroyed. But according to the BBC, this war has got to continue in order to keep this proxy war against Russia running, and that will be until the last Ukrainian soldier's dead. Let's just watch a little clip of UK support. We're going to put it up. There's not a lot of commentary in the video, but I wanted our viewers to be able to at least listen to the music as the MOD in UK puts forward its little video clip of the good work it's doing to help the killing continue.
C, 1.4G and some 1.2E, so lots of bangy stuff.
Well, of course, not all the world is standing with Ukraine, but what I picked up from that video clip was a large amount of applied psychology by the Ministry of Defence. You're not sure whether you're watching a proper report or it's some sort of movie, but this is the blurring of reality that we're seeing occurring. Is it fooling people on social media? Certainly not from the eastern side of Europe. So here we've got Stoltenberg being identified as telling porcupines by saying that NATO is not involved in the war. Meanwhile, the reality is rather different here. This is Politico. Europe accuses the US of profiting from the war, but we're never going to see the BBC reporting about this. And more reality, artillery breaking down in Ukraine. as these weapons suffer routine problems, which comes from the large number of shells being fired. They've got to transfer them back to Poland for repair. And of course, this is not effective in time and effort on the battlefield. And also a big thank you to Brian Berletic from the New Atlas for giving this report on the latest US arms to Ukraine, because the reality is, as we go through this, is that this is nowhere near sufficient to keep the Ukrainians supplied. So there's more of the NASAMS surface-to-air missiles, 150 heavy machine guns to apparently fight the Russian missile attacks. That is completely meaningless. Additional information for HIMARS and precision 155mm rounds, but a mere 200, a mere 10,000 mortar rounds. But this is where we can see what's happening with the vehicles, because we're no longer dealing in armoured vehicles, we're dealing in light tactical vehicles. And some of those, as we've seen on screen, appear to be civilian. Brian Berletic, as ex-forces himself, pointed out that whilst 20 million rounds of small arms ammunition appears a lot, in reality it isn't, and will only keep, I think it was a battalion supplied for a month. 200 generators is hardly going to counter the breakdown of the Ukrainian electricity supply, and spare parts for those 105mm howitzers that have already gone. So if you want to see the full report from him, you can go to YouTube and look for the New Atlas. But of course, reality here, the New York Times asking how Russia was able to launch its biggest aerial attack on Ukraine when the West has been told for some time that the amount of ammunition has been falling.
Okay, a few days ago, the wonderful former head of NATO, former Secretary General Lord Robertson was speaking. It was writing for The Economist. Headline is either Vladimir Putin loses or the West does. And let's see what he's saying. The war in Ukraine is about more than Ukraine in Vladimir Putin's view. It is part of his single-minded war on the West and on the kind of free societies that live there. Why don't we see that reality with sufficient urgency? And basically he's calling for direct and open warfare with Russia. So the war Mr. Putin wages against us is of a new sort, hybrid, multifaceted, under the radar, insidious, but it's still a war, and it's time we woke up to the seriousness of it. Disinformation, election meddling, corruption, organised crime, extraterritorial assassination, supply chain disruption and cyber interference is what he's alleging that Putin is responsible for. But then Putin also inserts his poison. Some of it is overt, but much of it more subtle. So if Russia is at war with us, why are we not defending our countries as if we were under attack? Why are we acting as if there's no threat to us? We've sent money and weapons to aid Ukraine in its defensive efforts, and we've sanctioned Russia and those close to Mr. Putin. But by responding to warlike attacks with peacetime processes, we end up damaged and compromised. So that's his position. We need to stop using peacetime processes, get down to the war. That's what he wants. I wonder what Rishi Sunak's position is. Well, here he is, and he's giving a speech at Mansion House tonight, and these are the words that he's going to use. This is a speech on foreign policy matters. He's saying freedom and openness have always been the most powerful forces for progress, but they have never been achieved by standing still. Under my leadership, we won't choose the status quo. We will do things differently. We will evolve, anchored always by our enduring belief in freedom, openness, and the rule of law. Yes, okay. And he goes on to say Ukrainian flags have flown over almost every town and city on these islands for the last 9 months. No one told people to put them there. They felt moved to show solidarity with people they've never met in a country most have never visited, to show their faith in fairness, freedom, and the rule of law. So everybody's really up for the rule of law. It's fantastic. But he says he's going to say tonight, be in no doubt, we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will maintain or increase our military aid next year. Our adversaries and competitors, and by that he means Russia and China, because that's what he says elsewhere in this, plan for the long term. On the face of these challenges, short-termism or wishful thinking will not suffice. And David, I want to get your thoughts on this, because the kicker's coming now. It means standing up to our competitors, not with grand rhetoric, but with robust pragmatism. Could you please tell me what that means?
I haven't got a clue. Not with grand rhetoric, but with robust pragmatism. No, if you've got a competitor, you compete. You try harder. We try harder. Why come to us? Why come to build cars or anything else in Britain? We will try harder. We will charge you less. We will tax you less. Our workforce will do better because we're better educated and we're more motivated. That's how you compete, Mr. Sunak. And as for George Robertson, we should defend our country as if under attack. But the reality is we're not. That's insane. It's absolutely. He's calling for war with a nuclear armed power. That it's in no way in Britain's interests. Not under any wild imagination is this in British interest.
No, sorry, David. This is not in the interests of the British people. There's a difference. There is a difference because we've got an occupying power. I think, as you said earlier in the program.
Yeah, it could. I'm not saying it's not in the interest of a global one world government agenda, but it's not in the interest of Britain or the British people. And George Robertson, his nickname when he was Scottish Secretary and the SNP used to hate him, their nickname for him was Chicken George. I always thought it was quite funny that they made Chicken George NATO Secretary. What George Robertson is calling for there is absolute insanity.
Yes, indeed. Okay, let's see what Ben Wallace is up to then. So here's the Daily Beast, because he gave them an exclusive interview a few days ago. Russia risks knockout blow in war as Putin hits rock bottom, is his position. And he's saying he is slamming successive UK and European governments for decades of neglect of their armed forces because we can't prosecute a war under the current circumstances. And I have to say, Brian, this is the first time, at least that I'm aware of, that we've had an open admission. I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, but this is what he had to say. If we just put that back on screen. I can speak for my own and some others in Europe. It looks good at the front, but under the bonnet, ammunition stocks, maintenance, availability, reliability of our equipment, and the readiness of our soldiers to go anywhere has been hollowed out for decades. Now, this is something that the UK column has been highlighting for a very, very, very long time, but I haven't seen it openly acknowledged, except under the circumstances that he's being spoofed by Russian, spoof callers. That he's actually openly admitted this.
Well, of course, the Russians have forced this to be declared because there isn't the ammunition that the UK or NATO wants to push into Ukraine. It does not exist and it can't be manufactured. So the rot in the armed forces, yes, has been going on a very long time, but it's been going on under the control of the Conservatives. And let's show more of the dangers of what's been going on inside the armed forces, because we've got another article sent to us. This is from the Daily Mail about a junior RAF officer who became pregnant by a Red Arrows commander, and she claims he tried to pressurise her into an abortion, telling her it's a bunch of cells, not a baby. I've labelled this breakdown of discipline continues in the UK military because this is what is actually happening. But have a look at how the twist goes in this story, because if we quote from the former lover, who of course is anonymous, she says she was shocked to see Monty, that's the male officer, withdrawn from duties. I do not want to see him lose his job, but I do not think he should lead the squadron because it's a mess. It needs sorting out. The culture was toxic when I was there, and my friends still in it say it got worse after I left. The tone is set from the top. But of course, this young lady was part of the culture. She goes on, there have been reports of a heavy drinking culture in the Red Arrows. Oh yes, there was. She says, I was part of it. Everybody was. There was a rule you couldn't be hungover at work. It was as bad as being drunk, but we all were. So she is totally involved in the breakdown of culture. Women were pursued by men, well, what a surprise, and harassed if they did not play ball. I witnessed it with a female colleague. Two of the men, one pilot, one a member of ground crew, were vying for her. Peacocking, we'd call it. It got quite obsessive and nasty. So there's a lot more we can comment on here. Perhaps we can do it in extra time. with an eye on the clock at the moment, but we are watching utter breakdown of the British Armed Forces from the inside as a result of the policies that successive Labour and Conservative governments have introduced. We're now seeing how poisonous this regime is, and of course ultimately people are going to die as a result of it, because they are not fit for purpose.
And the irony is that today the UK is hosting today and tomorrow the Preventing Sexual Violence and Conflict event. So that's taking place today and tomorrow. This is for survivors, with survivors. But in the meantime, aside what's going on in the RAF, of course, Brian was talking last week about what's going on in the Royal Navy. Well, here is Ben Key, the head of the Royal Navy, who's justifying what's been going on there. He said it's absolutely true that for a long time our investigation processes were too closely aligned with the chain of command, which could then on occasion be seen as presenting a conflict. This is with respect to sexual violence, well, in some cases sexual violence against female members of staff of the Royal Navy. We have changed it now so that anyone who wishes to raise a formal complaint, the admissibility and the handling of that complaint is immediately taken away from the unit they're serving and is assessed at the headquarters and will then be independently investigated. I would be really worried, this is the bit that really grabs me, Brian, I would be really worried that if we were setting ourselves in a completely independent process, we would both slow it down and actually lead to less good outcomes. What's he worried about here? Is he worried about a truly independent process would have something pretty negative to say about the culture within the Royal Navy?
Well, yeah, this is, brand management is what he's worried about. But of course, the reality is that this rot is now so pernicious, it's so pervasive at the heart of the British military that we have major problems in all sorts of other areas. And of course, senior British military officers over the years have been fully complicit in accepting these policies because they were too scared to stand up against them.
Right. So, David, let's move to Scotland then, and just very quickly.
Yeah, so this is a charity called Favour UK. The UK-wide charitable think tank and human rights advocacy service led by people who have experience of alcohol and drug addiction, or with family members who have had that addiction, and they are representing the communities affected by addiction and are campaigning an advocacy organisation. And they are led by this lady you see here, Anne-Marie Ward. A little bit about Anne-Marie, right? So we've got some detail here. Now, she's set up a lot of charities. She's done a great deal of charitable work. But it says in a previous life, Anne-Marie had addictions to various substances. She was not a drug of choice kind of gal. She liked them all until they stopped working. But she has been completely clear of all mood and mind-altering substances for 25 years and has done master's degrees at University of Glasgow and has led the efforts to do something about the truly horrendous drug and addiction problems in Scotland. Now, you would think that's reason enough to mention her on the column, but no, there's another reason I mention Anne-Marie Ward, because you see, Anne-Marie is an utter legend. She was running a 3-year campaign to do something about the addiction problem and the lack of treatment facilities in Glasgow. And there was a local Glasgow councillor who turned up during this 3 years twice, never said anything, didn't get involved. But when they were having a big event and the TV cameras were there, up he popped. We have some video showing how she reacted.
So he was a Glasgow councillor?
He was a Glasgow councillor. That's Graham Campbell is his name. And she threw him out. We've got a second video clip as she describes why she did it.
He's showed up at 2 events in the last 3 years, so and he's barely spoke a word to us during those events. He's not offered any support outside those events. He's, as far as I'm concerned, he showed up to get his photograph taken and to prove that he was there. There's been no support, so for him to stand up and say that that he's supported the campaign since it started is laughable, and that's beyond lies and manipulation. That's downright, I don't know. I mean, to lie like that is just a complete brass neck.
Brazen gall. If brass neck doesn't translate into American. Mark, we've got a little bit more here. We see the Herald describing how SNP's Graham Campbell was thrown out of that meeting. But the Sunday Post reports that Councillor Graham Campbell is now accused of threatening the charity. He allegedly told Anne-Marie Ward that there would be consequences and his people would withdraw support unless she apologised. Another councillor who witnessed the altercation claimed Campbell, whose partner is SNP MP Anne McLaughlin, it's all very incestuous in the SNP, told Ward funding for her charity could be cut. And a large part of Favour's budget comes from the Cora Foundation, which provides grants to support the National Drugs Mission on behalf of the SNP-led Scottish Government. The threats, which Campbell denied yesterday, were allegedly made after the incident you saw caught on camera. So we'll see if anything happens to her funding. But wasn't she magnificent?
Good stuff. Right, let's just finish then with a couple of final slides. I wanted to bring this on, bearing in mind the fact that the UK government is holding this sexual violence conference, because this is from Bob Moran, again, this cartoon. And of course, it's a take on Paddington, but it's a bear, a Russian bear, because you can see on his hat there, he's got the Russian coat of arms.
And blood on the paws.
And blood on the paws, of course. And it says, please put this bear up in a 4-star hotel. And on the suitcase, it says, wanted on charges of sexual violence. The mainstream press today, full of stories. In fact, over the last 3-4 weeks, just absolutely full of stories about claims that the Russian government is systematically using sexual violence in Ukraine. It's simply ridiculous. David?
That's an Albanian bear.
Oh, I do apologise. Okay. I thought that was a Russian crest on the. But okay, whatever you say.
I'm sorry.
That's Albanian.
All bears look the same to us, well, David.
Shocking. Okay, and just very quickly, David.
Yeah, I caught this over the weekend. I thought it rather summed up the position of the UK column audience. I hope many will agree with me. It's a quote from the Amplified Bible translation, 1 Thessalonians 5:6, but I thought it covered what we're about. So it says, so then, let us not sleep in spiritual indifference as the rest of the world does, but let us keep wide awake, alert and cautious, and let us be sober, self-controlled, calm and wise. And I hope you'll agree, gentlemen, that's what we're encouraging people to be.
I absolutely agree, David, but I think there's also other texts which would mean that we're not expected to sit idly by, but perhaps we can have a discussion on that at some point. We'll end the news there. Thank you to everybody who's joined us today. Thank you very much for people if you've come in from in particular if you've come in from overseas and at slightly unpleasant times of the day. It's great to have you with us, and a very big thank you to everybody who's supporting the UK column. We can only do what we do with your help and financial support, so thank you very much for that.
Extra in 2 minutes.
Extra in two minutes. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.